All right. So here's the plan, and you've known about this for a bit. And Robin, if you'll leave us 10 minutes to discuss upcoming assignments, that's all I asked for.
Just, throw things if I seem to get lost in time.
Well, they have to do that to me, that's for sure.
We all like to stay after.
Oh, yeah, you love staying past 10 o'clock, don't you?
What did I set? I don't know. I turned my phone off. I didn't set an alarm. Never mind.
All right, so we're going to start the class with some material that we didn't get to talk about very much from Alex, not this Alex. Alex, I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce your name. If you would at some point, your last name, if you would at some point send me an email with the pronunciation. So I don't mangle it. That'd be nice. So we're going to start with that conversation. Then we're going to, Dr. Reed's going to do her thing. She's an expert in this area. So that's she is. That letter for you. And as much of an expert, she's an expert in the contradictions. Yes? There is no such thing as an expert in this field because there's just.
And like I said, I sort of take on the idea of the bibliographic scholarship as a whole and then talk about the issues with how to handle writing about sources, which leads us to patch writing.
Yes. Before we do get started though, I would like everybody, you don't know everybody.
I know.
Let's start with Mike. You can introduce yourself.
I don't have to read.
Hi. I know some of you.
Shay?
She knows me too.
Okay.
I took her on mine. I'm gonna see it.
Oh, hi. Right. I think we've talked a couple times.
I'm Marie.
Marie.
They don't notice me.
Oh, okay.
Yes, we did.
You I'm Jolene Cash. You've seen me in a couple classes.
I'm Alex. We talked in the writing center last week.
Chris Fulbright. I don't think we've met before.
Is everybody here?
7.
Yes, 7. We have 7 live.
Right.
Okay. All right, so what I'm going to start with is Alex's post from last week that I didn't get to talk about, but it's some really, he's brought up some interesting concepts about, because he's been a second language learner. His writing is immaculate.
Right.
Is that the word I want? Yeah, impeccable. Impeccable. Yes. So I'm going to go over this and we can get a little bit of discussion in it. I found the discussion on patch writing very interesting. I also heard the term word bombing to describe what happens when a student patch writes a text in a similar way that online paraphrasing tools spit out nonsense. This had me thinking about the connection between patch writing and lack of conciseness and how both could indicate a lack of subject matter knowledge. With this post, I hope to share some thoughts related to the idea to start a conversation on that topic. I would also like to share an experience that I believe allowed me to learn through patch writing. So that goes kind of along with what Rebecca Moore Howard says about second language learners or just early writers in their attempts to appropriate academic discourse. When working on my MA in instruction design and technology, I learned that one way to make the instructional material more effective is to consider prior knowledge. The idea being that students will learn more effectively if instructors and instructional designers introduce new concepts by building upon what students already know. For instance, when students are introduced to algorithms, they are often told to write step-by-step instructions on how to perform an everyday task, such as getting a bowl of cereal. This can include steps such as get up from your chair, walk to the kitchen, open the top right cabinet, etc. Once they complete that, they're told, congratulations, you just wrote your first algorithm to solve the problem of getting cereal. At this point, students may be asked to define algorithm in their own words before a fancy definition of that term is introduced. If, on the contrary, the students were first given the definition of algorithms and then asked to write down their own definition, they may end up patch writing. This leads me to think that it could be interesting to research the relationship between prior knowledge or lack thereof and plagiarism. I also wonder what other thoughts may be on the notion that patch writing may be a sign of poor instructional design. Now, I would also argue that patch writing can help some students learn something new. I remember in the 9th grade, I was completely lost in my biology class. One day, my teacher asked me to write a summary of some concept. I don't remember what it was. The summary had to be long enough to cause me anxiety, say 500 words. In desperation, I started writing my essay. It is, I love this, Miguel de Cervantes all of a sudden fell in love with biology. I squeezed every fancy word I could out of my teenage brain, saying nothing for the most part, and rewriting the same handful of sentences to death, which is what you do in a dissertation, actually.
Thank you. Helpful hints.
My summary was poetic, descriptive, and much like a political speech coming from the president of Venezuela. It said nothing of real value. However, while I admit that I don't remember what the essay was about, I do remember feeling like I had finally understood the concepts that my teacher asked me to summarize. Patch writing may not just be what happens when a student does not know how to paraphrase, but may also indicate that, like me, the student is completely lost. And I can certainly see that as being, Robin is shaking her hair. I'm sorry, Dr. Reed, I always feel like, okay, we're graduate students, yeah.
First names are cool, but you can call me, whatever.
Yeah, it's kind of like saying, your dad. That was when my mom, no, dad. Yes. Did you have any? Oh, you're
Oh, no, man, I'm just popping fingers,
Can I ask, Robin, will you speak to that with the head nodding that you were doing on his last, on what he said?
Oh, and it's brilliant, yes, completely. Oh, I'm sorry. No, Alex, yes, it is absolutely brilliant. Because what I've been learning the past few years since I got into this project, which I'll talk about, this form of inadvertent plagiarism at best, and Rebecca Moore Howard argues we shouldn't even really consider it any kind of plagiarism, except perhaps when it makes it into the final drafts and then it can be tagged as plagiarism, is a natural part of how to learn to write, to understand. That, and when we were in the writing center the other day, Diana brought up imitatio, that rhetorical trick where you used to imitate what you were studying until you could write it, say learning how to write a sonnet, that is a good way to learn how to write. So that this sort of thing where you start out with quotes and then you sort of start to change them and then you try and imitate what you see is a natural part of learning how to do it. And if we don't build that in, if we expect students to know it on their own, this is when we often end up with things that look sort of like patch writing, but of course are not intentional. And much of how university systems are set up cannot take that into account, especially because many classrooms don't allow process writing, don't teach these concepts. I mean, we're sort of over in our English department doing what we do, but try to talk to some of your colleagues in physics, sociology, or whatever about all this, and we don't get very far. But yes, it is certainly necessary as a way of learning, and I totally agree that I've seen, I mean, your very poetic, descriptive summary of how you wrote the summary and ending up mostly as gibberish is the sort of thing I see in writing all the time. The thing that surprises some of my colleagues is I don't teach the first year composition classes. So I'm not looking at this in composition. I'm seeing it in my upper level English classes, literature courses. I do teach the technical writing, so I see it in that all the time. There, of course, we have students who have not taken very much writing. So that's one thing. I see it in the graduate courses.
Yes.
And that's what gets my graduate students shocked when we work through this together, because graduate students have been writing for a long time. They don't, until they start looking at what patch writing is and exploring it, they never think that what they do may be that.
And so that's where, again, it gets into this very gray area because you have to sort of become conscious of it. And I also really like the idea of patch writing coming because you don't take into account what students do or do not know. I think that is a very astute cause.
And when you were talking about doing the sonnets and writing sonnets over, or imitating a particular author and just, practicing that, I think as I went through my college career, as I already had a good sense of language because I worked for attorneys, and I had a really, really brilliant attorney I worked with, and his language was gorgeous. And so when I started my undergrad, I had that good sense, but then when I started reading articles, I started to pick up on how they structure their sentences, how the words that they use, the lexicon associated with their particular area, and then start picking up on, oh, I like the way that sounds. I'm going to take that word and incorporate it into my work. And so my vocabulary is always changing. As long as I'm reading, it's changing. And so I've developed my own style, most certainly my own voice, but we always walk a very fine line, very fine line.
And actually what you're saying about seeing good words and using them, this sort of the simple idea of plagiarism where you're supposed to summarize in your own words. Well, some of the students will completely contort their prose to avoid using any single word that was in the source in such a way that, that's when they pull out the thesaurus and look for words and drag up all these weird things, but that can take it very far from the meaning of it. So how do you walk that line of, well, you have to use the key words. So if some of the words are in your summary, that's only appropriate. But what you can't do is copy all the phrases around it and copy the structure and do that. And that is a very fine distinction. And if you're not trained to read really, really carefully, you're not going to be able to look at that and say, okay, here I'm too close now. And I mean, I have students who will run their own work through the online plagiarism checkers and say, well, it said there's no plagiarism. Well, I won't get into it today, but there's huge amounts of scholarship from composition people on how Turnitin and all the other ones are bad. They false positives, false negatives, and all sorts of problems. They simply do not work, and they certainly do not work for this thing we call patch writing, because what they're looking for are exact phrases copied. So they miss out entirely. So the idea that we can have some tools to work with that gets old really quickly. So thoughts, comments?
And well, I am going to add one more thing too, and that is that when I've noticed that when students, regardless of their level, have difficulty with their writing changes. If they have difficulty with a concept,
if you're learning something new, your skills that you've learned go down.
They go way down. So there's this, oh, well, I'm going to guess that either you're uncomfortable with it, you don't understand it, or something.
That's why when all the process writing, I teach almost totally online, as some of you know. When I do the process writing, I don't grade on grammar or mechanics at all, especially in graduate course. So, because just to emphasize, the important thing is to learn to do this, not to be able to be, I mean, there are other things that can collapse, but that is one of the things that goes, because if you're concentrating so hard on how to work with this theory, comma splices, who cares?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Lacan, who you is a comma splice.
Probably.
Yeah, probably.
So.
One of the articles that Dr. Stewart posted for this week, just to kind of read through, kind of talked about those different levels of, there's kind of an acceptable way to paraphrase and an unacceptable way to paraphrase. That unacceptable manner of paraphrasing kind of does similar to what you were talking about, right?
What I'm going to talk here is there are multiple
substituting some words here and there, changing sentence structures a little bit, but essentially it's giving you the same information at the same level of detail as your source material, Whereas like an acceptable paraphrase would be, you're rewording it, you're still covering it at more or less the same level, but you're also analyzing what was said.
You're synthesizing, you're more concise.
Right, where you're kind of processing it and giving some insight from your own perspective.
Even though you're summarizing, you've done enough critical analysis to say, and this is the big thing, what is the most important and relevant thing? So,
The enlightening thing.
I'm sorry, if I'm going to get started, could I call my PowerPoint up?
You bet.
All that?
In fact,
Yeah, one of the
Or
things.
could you show me how
that
to
was
get to my email?
enlightening
I've got
from
it
that
here.
article for me though was
Oh.
the way that it clearly represented the difference between summarizing and paraphrasing.
Mhm.
You kind of get this general idea, okay, yeah, there's a difference, and you kind of think that you know the difference, but this spelled it out in a really nice way where
What was their definition?
just the summary was to, just kind of what we were talking about last week too, you weren't here, but where you step away from it, you think about it, you put it into your own words, and it's more kind of your succinct version of what you read, which can, to your point, and probably should use some of the same words that were in the source material because it's part of the language of the whatever the topic is, right? But,
And that's how you learn
yeah.
your scholarly vocabulary, is by practicing these scary, weird terms. The problem is, and I realized this when reading Rebecca Moore Howard and looking at all the plagiarism resources online, there are different definitions of summary and paraphrase, and certainly across disciplines. My friend in history and I have some ongoing conversations because they use Chicago. We use MLA, although Chicago gets used quite a lot in literary studies and possibly, I don't know as much about composition and linguistics, but she often helps me out by Chicagoizing essays after they've been accepted for print, and the editor says, "Surprise, Chicago!" Evil. And she comes in sometimes and goes, "Rrr, rrr, 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 rrr," because things that are perfectly correct in MLA look like plagiarism to a Chicago person. And I can say, because I have students in my tech writing who do APA, they rely way too heavily on parenthetical, and if you're being a little bit clumsy with APA style, it looks like plagiarism to an MLAist. So that makes it even more complicated.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah, well, how often do we talk across those gang boundaries? Sorry, there's a great comic about how the MLA and Chicago people get together and beat up the PhD comics, yeah. So yes.
I have all of the documents you sent me.
Okay, well,
here.
I just need the PowerPoint to go with.
And here it is.
Yeah, there we are. And I just have to,
Yeah, I don't have a little.
if I stand here, will that be okay?
Yeah, oh yeah, that's where I.
Ah!
What did it do? Oh,
No, there are all sorts of
Oh.
machines up here.
yeah,
Don't touch anything.
Yeah, I've turned it off by accident before. So
I
let's
know.
leave it there, and then you work from over there.
I was gonna say, how about if I pull this over?
Okay. Because every time I shut it down,
Yeah.
it screws everything up. Oh, yeah.
Okay.
But you don't have to do much.
Nah, that's your story. So yes, it just keeps getting more and more and more complicated is what I'm saying. But before we get to that, I want to talk about the precursor up to that, because this also comes into the difficulty of doing bibliographic scholarship. That's what you guys are doing in this class, right? So you're going to have to write a bibliographic essay. So could you tell me what a bibliographic essay is and does?
It's basically a compilation of several different essays or articles on another topic. We give short little summaries. Yeah, there we go. Summaries of the articles, and the author typically makes a blanket, not exactly an argument, but like a purpose statement almost. They can't make an argument, they don't always have to, and they basically give you the leading minds in this particular arena.
You know what Jolyn said?
That is one kind, but there's often the analytical thing is to make the argument about the nature of the scholarship. So in a sense, if you're working toward a thesis or a dissertation, you're doing a review of literature. And that sounds nice and simple, but I've taught 599, I've taught 595. You've done it even more than I have. Is it simple for our students to do? No. I have one fantastic student who has been blocked on her 595 for almost 2 years now. There's just something about this, and she and I are both sitting there going, why? So anyway, so I came in because I love bibliographic scholarship.
So do I.
And Dr. Hayes does too. There aren't many people who do. So I'm going to talk about it and give you some tips for how to sort of go about things. And part of all this is because, yes, you don't just line up summaries of your sources. I mean, that's an annotated bibliography, which you're also doing, which is an incredibly useful first step. But it's moving from that to synthesize, analyze, and argue when, especially if you're in literature, you're going, when do I get to write about my poem or my play? If you're in composition or linguistics, when do I get to write about my linguistic situation or my classroom design? Why do I have to keep writing about the scholarship? So, but there is a purpose for it. So, the first part of this talk is adapted from a longer one that I actually gave at MythCon, which is the Mythopoeic Society's annual conference, where I attended as the scholar guest of honor last summer because of my bibliographic research, which is primarily in Tolkien studies. Although I do have one essay on Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451. And as I said, I've taught the 599 and the 595 and helped with redesigning them from what they were in earlier years, which is basically dragging students to the library and marching them around the reference section, which no longer exists. So I was happy to come in and talk. But I want to start with a confession. Becoming a fan of bibliographic scholarship was a mid-career shocker for me because I never had this course in my graduate schools. I never had a class on bibliographic and methods. My first master's was in creative writing, and they very kindly exempted us from that very, very hard bibliography and methods course because we would never need it. My second was at the Breadloaf School of English, which was a summer master's program for teachers started by Robert Frost, and they wanted to get rid of a lot of what they considered the unnecessary impedimenta of masters, which included GRE, language requirement thesis, and bibliography. When I
What's the point of getting a master's?
It was great fun. It was really, in a way, for people who were teaching on the high school level. It was deep immersion in the literature and thinking about it. I did not seek out a bibliography course when I finally got to a doctoral program because I shared the common attitude that having to read essays about literature is kind of tedious and boring compared to reading the literature. So I was sort of in the, you get your brilliant interpretation of the poem in mind, then you read long enough to get some quotes to support your argument and you're good, right? That's what I thought at the time. I was wrong. But I'm a self-taught bibliographic scholar, and this kind of stuff I do kind of hovers on the edge of what the Bibliographical Society of America defines as the official field of bibliographic scholarship. They are, by the way, one of the oldest scholarly societies. They started in 1904. They define bibliography as the, quote, study of books and manuscripts as physical objects. So old style bibliographers, you had to describe the print, the size, the range, the cover, all this other stuff. You know, words in it, words on the page, it's not that important. It was the material objects, and that obviously has its function. They've expanded these days. You have articles and lists about texts and other media on sort of topics in all sorts of disciplines. There's even a term for a bibliography of web pages. It is arachneography. Arachneography. It was invented by a NASA engineer, Andrew J. Butryka, because, as the entry on whatis.com says, he first thought of calling it a webography, but disliked the mixed etymology, the Germanic web paired with the Greek graphy. His brother, a classics professor, which probably assumes why he knew it was mixed etymology, suggested coining two Greek words. Arachne, of course, goes back to the myth of Arachne, who was turned into a spider who spun webs. So, poetry from a NASA engineer for a bibliography of web pages. So, some bibliographic scholars focus completely on the works by and about their authors. That's Dr. Hayes. Have you ever heard about Will Self and his saying? He is the official bibliographer of Will Self. And those, of course, become the foundations that for the work that we do. And there are bibliographic publications in Tolkien scholarship that are pretty foundational. I actually brought them because I thought, great, a visual aid. And especially nice for this class, visual aids that are books. Woohoo! And these are not stolen from libraries. They were bought on Amazon.com used. So,
Sure. Yes, every conference she goes to, she makes it a plan to steal a book.
Everyone's got their turn.
So the first one, the very slim one going around from the back row, is by Richard West. He published Tolkien Criticism, an annotated checklist with Kent State University Press in 1970. But its first publication was actually in Orcrist 1, a fanzine. Because at least in my areas that I study, which are science fiction and fantasy, the fans have been doing bibliographies for years before the academics get involved, because we were all too snooty to do so. This is a 73-page publication that includes Tolkien's own scholarship and fiction, starting in the 1920s and ending in 1969. I think it includes stuff by Tolkien and about Tolkien. He's looking at completeness as a goal and provides information about each source, including fanzines, who of course were earliest writing about Tolkien's work in a scholarly way. And he couldn't include a lot of them in his index because it was so hard to track them down. It's organized in sections: A on Tolkien's works, B on articles and books about Tolkien, and C on reviews of single books by Tolkien, and D is an index of all the titles selected. So of course, in the pre-internet days, we had to do it the hard way. Imagine he used index cards. The second Tolkien bibliography, which is circulating from the front row, came out in 1986, created by Judith Johnson and published by Greenwood Press as the 6th volume in their Bibliographies and Indexes in World Literature series. This 266-page bibliography is organized chronologically, with the first chapter covering 1922 to 1952 publications, and then each succeeding chapter taking a decade through 1984. Her book covers only reviews and criticisms of Tolkien's work, which actually includes his scholarship on Beowulf, as well, of course, as the fiction. And her introductions does what you were talking about, points out some general patterns in the critical responses in each time period. So Richard's is just a list. Here it is, organized. Judith began commenting on what was happening and working toward an argument. And it's an appendix with 2 indexes. The appendix lists Tolkien-related organizations and their journals, so you can try to track them down. The 2 bibliographies share some common themes. Both note the impossibility of a complete bibliography, the impossible dream of every bibliographer dreams, I suspect.
For 5 minutes.
For a few minutes, and then you realize you die first. It credits work done by fans and other scholars and invites corrections, additions, and future. And both choose to include popular criticism, fanzine commentary, general periodicals, as well as academic criticism relating to Tolkien. And of course, the scholarship on Tolkien didn't get really started until the 50s and 60s, so there was stuff going on all along. I like Johnson's explanation of why she doesn't separate popular and academic. I'll just note that in 595 and 599, we expect you to find the peer-reviewed stuff. Popular commentary is sort of in a different category. Yeah.
They get to do that later.
Yeah, you can do that. So many of the stuff, books that I work with are so recently published, I often collect the popular reviews and stuff to have a sort of thing to talk about. She thinks the separation of those two categories is artificial and misleading, and points out that without his scholarly interests in philology, medieval literature, and mythology, he would never have written his fantasy. Without his interest in fantasy, he probably would not have been attracted to the work that was his life's work. So that really, these are all interchangeable for Tolkien, and Lang and Lit were all connected. Another type of bibliographic scholarship are the essays I mentioned. That focuses on the published scholarship. In Tolkien studies, Michael D.C. Drought and Hilary Wynne, who was a graduate student publishing with her professor, got together and published an authoritative essay accompanying their 30-page bibliography of Tolkien scholarship from 1984 to 2000, and then analyzing it. This was Tom Shippey's J.R.R. Tolkien, Author of the Century, and a look back at Tolkien criticism. They identified two problems in Tolkien studies. So their essay goes more than just noting basic patterns. They said, here are the problems. This is what you all should do going forward. That is, they were identifying things that coming up scholars need to address, in their opinion, of course, but they supported it. One was the problem that the tendency of Tolkien scholars is not to read the earlier published Tolkien scholarship before writing their stuff. And the second is making fun of fandom. And this is true. If you read the early academic stuff on Tolkien, every single academic anthology starts out with, it's very unfortunate that there are all these people who are whack-doodles who think that Tolkien's work is so good. And if it just stops being popular, we can do some serious academic criticism. I am only paraphrasing slightly. They really saw themselves as different and needing to get rid of that embarrassing fandom. This reflected the period of the time where new criticism was big, and anything that was popular couldn't possibly be good literature. So this is what they say should be addressed in Tolkien studies. They identify other bibliographic resources. I learned about Judith Johnson's book from the Shippey and Drought essay, the Drought and Wynne essay. And they analyze the scholarship that goes from Shippey's Author of the Century, which is considered a major watershed work in Tolkien criticism, forward. They talk about the major themes, the topics in Tolkien scholarship, textual and manuscript history, source studies, themes of good and evil, mythology for England, and then identify, as I said, those weaknesses and gaps. Another weakness they identified was critics thinking they had to defend Tolkien against all the mean critics, which is not unnatural in early scholarship on a popular writer. Nearly 20 years later, when I am reading essays that are sent in to scholarly journals, where I read and you know, I'm one of those nasty people who says accept, revise, reject, or stuff that comes to me as the head of Tolkien studies of popular culture, I can say that there is still a problem with people not reading the scholarship on Tolkien. This actually is broader than Tolkien. It applies to science fiction generally. My explanation is that most people don't take graduate courses in science fiction or fantasy or Tolkien if they don't have access to people like Susan or me. So they don't know their scholarship out there. They've never been required to look at it, and they just sort of assume, well, I'm the first Victorianist who's noticed that Tolkien did this, and then they show up and read their stuff, and the Tolkienists in the audience say, excuse me, you should go read so-and-so and so-and-so and so. It really, it does become embarrassing. But the good news is we're not mocking Tolkien fandom anymore, because most of us came out of Tolkien fandom before we were academics. So we know how awesome we are. The major journals in the field, Tolkien Studies, Mythlore, publish bibliographic things. They're keeping up year by year. Tolkien Studies, I think, is just now dealing, I think, with 2016. And I've stuck some examples of the Tolkien Studies year in Tolkien's work, so you could see that. That's the short synopsis with a little bit of an introduction. That is, of course, a much more concise way to do it. They cover bibliographies of Tolkien's works, and we've now started putting together bibliographies of the major scholars of Tolkien's work, specifically Tom Shippey. So if you now see bibliography as sort of like Cthulhu taking over the world, you're exactly right. That's what we're doing. A really great librarian I know in Tolkien Studies has done a superb essay that's on our online peer-reviewed journal on bibliographic resources to find stuff on Tolkien, especially for independent scholars who, of course, are not always able to access the databases that cost so much money. The goals of Drought and Wind's essay, which is quite close to the one that you'll be doing for this class, is to identify the patterns. What has been addressed? How is it defined? What are the disagreements? What are the agreements? What are the gaps? And that, of course, is where, especially when you get to that stage where you know the scholarship well enough to see, this is pretty much a consensus, unless I can say something really radical. Don't need to write on that topic. There's not a lot on this topic, I could develop it, or using this critical approach to this topic, I could develop it, or there's nothing on this, it's a gap, I get to fill it. That leads to the being able to answer the so what question in your defense, where someone, it used to be Dr. Fulkerson, do we have an official person in the department who always says it these days?
I think most of us do.
Most of us just do. I say, so what? I said, why is it worth doing your original project? Well, it's worth doing because nobody has done it. Nobody has argued this yet. You are contributing something original. But to get to that original stage, you have to have deeply engaged with and understand the scholarship. Otherwise, odds are you're going to be doing a sort of patch writing on a grand scale where you try and say something authoritative about your topic, whatever it is, that's already been said many times, and you just don't realize it. Now, that said, there's no easy definition of a gap. The gaps that there are in Tolkien studies are very different from the gaps in Shakespeare studies. Because Shakespeare's been written about so much. I don't know what the gaps are in Shakespeare studies, but obviously they're probably going to be different and smaller. But people still publish original peer-reviewed scholarship on Shakespeare. So,
And
I
I
have a
can,
question.
go ahead.
So, just looking at this book made me think of this, and it would be something that I'm interested in, but I have a similar book called The Last Kelp, and it's a bibliographic collection of works by and about, in some cases, Robert E. Howard. And a lot of the work that's been done from a scholarly perspective are from amateur press associations, right? Like RIHUPA and places like that. And so they're not necessarily scholars. In that case, where there may be a dearth of work having been done, but not necessarily by scholarship, by
Peer-reviewed scholars.
Source, not peer-reviewed scholars. I'm guessing that's probably not I mean, I guess my question is, would that be a good place to jump in and maybe start kind of you could have a bibliographic essay that surveys the work that's been done from an amateur perspective, and then try to put your foot in the door with some actual peer-reviewed scholarship. Would that maybe not be a good way to start?
It depends on what you're doing it for. I mean, what sort of class, what sort of purpose, what sort of audience. Let me give you a couple of more useful terms. You guys.
I guess I'm guessing by default, where I'm kind of going with this is, I'm guessing by default, you're not going to put your foot in anywhere with a bibliographic essay, anywhere that there hasn't already been a pretty good amount of scholarship done on a topic. Right?
Peer-reviewed scholarship.
Peer-reviewed scholarship.
Nonsense. I do that all the time. If we didn't do it, we'd still be reading only Shakespeare. Nobody would be reading Tolkien. The book that
where would you start?
The book in my 780 class this semester is the first in a series by Rachel Kane. It's a YA novel on what happened if the great Library of Alexandria didn't burn. I can guarantee there is not a single academic piece of scholarship on it, but my students are writing on it. In this case, they're applying theory. Okay. So if they then go on to develop it, they would need to do scholarship. And at that point, you'd be looking, at least if I were advising people, you would look for what some of the big reviews are out there. But you would also look at what's the scholarship on YA novels? What's the scholarship? It's an alternate history. What's the peer-reviewed scholarship on alternate history novels? What is the peer-reviewed scholarship on X, Y, or Z? So when you're looking for peer-reviewed scholarship that is relevant to your topic, you can't define it only as the single author. You have to say genre, period, sort of larger things. Now, Howard, I suspect if you did some MLA searches on Howard, have you done anything on MLA for Howard?
I haven't. It just occurred to me when I looked at this book and I thought, gosh, I've got this book that already has a pretty extensive bibliography of stuff by and about him.
Good. There's been more recently science fiction. In fact, I know one brilliant book by an Australian scholar that looks at Howard and Tolkien together in the context of how they handled race and how it reflected the context of the time and how their work has become the foundation for Dungeons and Dragons, fantasy, all this other stuff. So what happened was we had a shift from literary studies in the elitist new criticism to cultural studies, which takes a more historical thing of any text that is produced reflects the human culture. It's all worth analyzing. Yay, let's talk about Tolkien or Howard.
And also in response, okay, I had it.
Oh,
It's slipping away. What is it? If the question is, okay, so take Shakespeare, for instance. Early critics would not have theorized on race theory regarding Shakespeare because it hadn't been developed yet. So that's when a new branch started. Then, and after the new critics and the feminists were taking a look at Shakespeare and saying, that starts a new branch. And then trauma comes in, new branch, Marxism, new branch. So these keep growing.
and in fact, I have done the bibliographic searches and I have gotten the numbers using MLA, which I'll show you how to do this in a few minutes, to prove that there has been more published on Shakespeare since these new critical theories became dominant than were published before. You can see the numbers. Now, you can argue some of it is because we've had an inflation of numbers of people writing, but what we can say is the huge fear, this started in the 80s, and George Will, Alice Walker will replace Shakespeare and Western civilization will fall. We're still hearing variants of it, but you can actually, not that it will matter to people like George Will, you can prove that in fact Shakespeare has not disappeared from the college curriculum or scholarship. But yeah, every time you have different theories or new theories, you can do that. But science fiction as a whole, I could name 4 or 5 peer-reviewed journals. Science fiction criticism in the literary area, as well as in history, has been growing since the 70s. And I would be surprised. Do a quick search on Howard and MLA. But if you were working on a sort of intellectual history, if you were working on, how many of you heard the term reception studies? Reception studies is when you start studying not the text, but how people have received it, how people have read it. If you were doing a reception study on Howard, that bibliographic resource would be a gold mine. Some reception study is done in psychology and communication. They go out and survey people and what they think. There was a huge project on the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit films. Worldwide surveys, multiple languages. They collected enough data to drown in. And that's not English literature because we don't do statistics. That's media and communications. But I'm doing an essay right now I'm working on where I'm looking at, I had a little survey, it's a qualitative survey, I put it online, I got 113 people fill it in. I'm doing an essay on how atheists, agnostics, and other secular readers who are fans of Tolkien read him because of this whole thing of, well, he was Catholic, it's really a Catholic, you have to read it in terms of the religious things. So I'm not going to make an argument about what Tolkien's fiction said about religion or not, I'm going to say here are what his fans say about Tolkien's work in the context of a lot of assumptions that since he was Catholic and he talked about this and all that, you have to take that as the meaning of his work. So it all depends what project you're doing and how you can work with it. And one of the reasons I became the critical theory type person is because, well, Foucault specifically, but almost any theory will let you do almost anything you want.
I mean, I don't want to sidetrack. My comment is, I mean, I wouldn't be a graduate studies at this stage of my life if I didn't want to, you know, add some scholarship to the conversation about the authors that I feel like haven't been studied, at least at length, right? And to try and add that to the conversation.
Exactly
right?
what
So I
Hunter
want-
did with Wilson.
Yeah, that's why we all.
Precisely.
I'm just
And
starting
how-
to think about
How many comp and/or linguistics people do we have? I really don't want to feel you guys horribly left out.
Stop it, Maria.
Maybe. She's coming back. She
Okay.
doesn't know yet.
So, but yes, the same thing, you know, you come because you have enough passion to make it through the barriers and gatekeeping. You want to say something new. It's just sometimes it's really boring to be told you have to read all the old stuff. But you don't know that you're saying something, and some of it's good. So yeah, but good question. And the Howard thing is interesting. So, and actually I was going to mention this. What I'm going to talk about now in terms of using the MLA to get a sense of what's out there beyond just has anybody written on Howard. I use the MLA database because I'm in literary studies. If you are in composition, are you going to change or not? I know this because I had to query Doctors Carter, Donna Dunbarton, and Pausek on what the composition people do, which is an online database of composition studies created by composition people, because MLA is lousy when it comes to composition, called Compile. It is. I don't know. Linguistics is complicated because it's sometimes a science and sometimes a humanities. I work with Dr. Hempelman on the humanities area, so I don't know what databases you all use, but if they're in the big EBSCO system, these general principles will apply. You just won't be sticking Tolkien in there. Although there's fascinating linguistic work on Tolkien. Never mind. Huh? Yeah.
He wrote absolutely. It's language.
He invented languages.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Okay. Drought and Wynne identified two significant gaps in Tolkien scholarship. And these aren't the problems. The problems are what the scholars were doing. The gaps are what they're not doing. And this is as of 2000. The lack of attention paid to Tolkien's writing style, except to say it was bad, or stylistic analysis, and very little work applying contemporary socio-historical critical theories that involve constructions of race, class, and gender, and sexual orientation and nationality in Tolkien's work. Drought, as a medievalist and one of the three biggest named Tolkien scholars on the planet, and Wynne, his graduate student, expressed some doubt about the value of these critical theories. The medievalists have been duking it out over critical theories a while longer than the rest of us. But even so, they say that for Tolkien studies to completely ignore these would be to self-isolate from the mainstream of literary criticism, where, you know, it's a lost cause. We're going to talk about it. So I agreed with them in 2000 when I read the essay. And while we have made some progress in the stylistics area, people who are analyzing Tolkien's style and using applied linguistics and all sorts of cool things over the past 19 years, and a fair amount has been paid to gender, because there are a whole lot of Tolkien fans and academics who are women, despite the assumption that girls don't like Tolkien or The Hobbit because not enough girls. Turns out we do. That was really funny with the film when we were all going around, yeah, nothing to like in that film if you're a woman at all. Nothing. So, large gaps regarding race, class, and sexuality. So, the other criticism Drottnwin had of the growing number of publications in Tolkien's work is that there was, quote, a glut of materials on the MLA database, which made it difficult to find the good articles. Dimitra Fimi, who wrote the first book on race in Tolkien studies, she's a British scholar, expressed a more positive attitude in her 2009 monograph titled Tolkien, Race and Cultural History, From Fairies to Hobbits. Though academics are elitist by nature, there has not been any better time for the inclusion of an author such as Tolkien in mainstream academic research. The boundary between high literature and fiction that appeals to the masses has become blurred, especially with the advent of theory and cultural studies. Classical texts are analyzed alongside comics. You think Howard is Howard is almost old school compared to graphic novels and comics and stuff that are now being studied. And popular fiction and films are discussed as texts worth reading. In this context, Tolkien can be rediscovered and reanalyzed in a serious way. I tend to agree with Fimi more on this, and I actually appreciate the wide range of material indexed by the MLA, because although it includes peer-reviewed scholarship, it is not limited to it. It's not quite fanzines, but it gets complicated here because two of the Tolkien scholarly societies that exist now started as fan clubs in the 60s. And so they went from fanzines, in Mithlor's case, to academic peer-reviewed scholarship in a few decades.
Yeah, it takes a while for everybody to forget what they first were.
Oh, Mithlor is proud as all get out. They're making all of it available. They're saying, hey, this is where we came from. Neener, neener, neener. I agree with Drow and Wynn that wandering your way through the forbidding forest of Tolkien criticism can be difficult. And, you know, we've all had students that go in, they put their subject in for a search, either in a database or online, and they get how many hundred and how many thousand hits. And then what do? Well, they grab the top 5 or so, or you know, they give up in disgust. And I mean, we've all tried to teach people better search strategies. When I started poking around with some of the stuff I do, I found some ways to use the MLA that when I talk about it to my students and colleagues, not everybody thinks to use it. For example, you put your search in the MLA, say Howard, or Ron, whatever. Do you know that with a couple of clicks, you can shift the order of the citations list that you have so that the oldest is first on top or the newest? You can,
I haven't told them that. I forgot about that.
you can coordinate by author, so you can manipulate the list of results that come out. And you can do some even more fun things. And I'm going to talk about this as an early step when you start researching a topic, just to get an overview of it. And of course, you know, you save it all and you can pull it up. So their criticism is based on the idea that the major reason you read scholarship is to identify the best scholarship. Now, I'm not saying that all academic and peer-reviewed scholarship is equally good. I have read some stinkers in my time that I sit around wondering, okay, what did you have on that editor to get this published? But I will still talk about them because the point is that essay at that time was doing something. I am not looking for the best work. I'm looking for representative and outliers and all this stuff. Plus, I have a narrower focus than they do because I focus on feminist, critical race, queer, and intersectional works. And so I can actually do pretty comprehensive bibliographic essays because there are not that many things. The first bibliographic essay I published appeared in Janet Renning-Crofts and Leslie Donovan's Perilous and Fair, Women in the Works and Life of J.R.R. Tolkien, for which, in a moment of total insanity, I proposed writing a bibliographic scholarship analyzing the scholarship on female characters in Tolkien's Legendarium from a feminist perspective. Now, this wasn't the feminist scholarship. This was a feminist analyzing all the scholarship on female characters, much of which is not feminist at all. So I've actually made a copy of that available for Dr. Stewart's class if you want to look at that. As I explained in the first paragraph, the purpose of this bibliographic essay, quote, is to provide an historical overview of fan, independent, and academic scholarship on female characters in J.R.R. Tolkien's Legendarium. Tolkien Studies has a large number of independent scholars. These are people who often have PhDs, who are academically trained, who do not work in academia. And I mean, given the incredibly sucky state of the job market these days, one of the biggest Tolkien guys, John Ratliff, works for a gaming company in Seattle. Another, Jason Fisher, works for Microsoft. Probably make pretty good money, and they do their scholarship. So independent scholars, that means someone who's doing often peer-reviewed scholarship, often groundbreaking work. Doug Anderson's The History of the Hobbit. He was a bookseller and a Hobbit fan. So, but they're not employed at a university. The element that makes this essay feminist is not that the scholarship is defined as feminist or written by self-identified feminists, although some is, or even limited to authors who identify as women. Instead, as a feminist trained in cultural studies, I identify articles and book chapters that primarily focus on Tolkien's female characters. There were no whole monographs by single authors on nothing but the female characters in Tolkien studies yet, and there still isn't. Stella's dissertation could have been. My analysis of the scholarship showed 3 changes over time. More attention paid to female characters, yes. More scholarship using contemporary theories and methods, and a change in publication venues, from fanzines to peer-reviewed journals to academic collections. And that's the progress you see. Cutting-edge stuff will almost always appear in journals first because they publish more quickly. It can take a long time to put together an academic collection and longer to do a monograph. So if you're looking for the cutting-edge, newest stuff in your field, that's why we send you to look for journal articles. My goal wasn't to say what the best scholarship on female character was, although I have my personal favorites. Edith Crow's essay on Power and Arda, Leslie Donovan's Valkyrie essay. But my goal in the essay was to analyze how these theories, method, and arguments developed over time, because as a cultural studies person, I am looking at the context. As feminism developed, so too did feminist readings, and more attention paid to female characters and to women generally in the life of Tolkien. So this is the kind of approach that is, I don't think it's an opposition to, it's a different branch than we're looking for the best scholarship and the best literature. Nowadays, of course, a whole lot of the scholarship coming out is on all the adaptations of Tolkien's work. The films, of course, put it into a whole new area. And again, despite everybody's fears, more stuff on Tolkien's fiction accompanied the scholarship on the films. So they're really not mutually exclusive. So I've been working on Tolkien studies, oh my goodness, it's now about 16 years. Which is where many of your faculty in their areas of specialization are. But when I first started, I had to start getting a sense of what was out there. You always know the big names because you hear them, but what do you do when you're looking with MLA? So what I did was I went through a search in 2018, and I did some of my organizing and analyzing the data simply based on what was published, when it was published, and some of the subject headings. So the subject search, a plain subject search, nothing more. Now, hint, if you ever do a subject search on Tolkien, keep it in terms of the specific subject, not the broad one, because there are several journals that have Tolkien's name in their titles. So if you do Tolkien as a wide open subject, you get a whole bunch of stuff that's not about Tolkien, but published in those journals. I mean, you can wipe it out, but now you just go to do it. I do this once a year to see what has been recently published, because you have to keep up with it. I should note the MLA does not list all possible sources for Tolkien criticism, but it is one of the largest databases in the fields of literature, folklore. It does have linguistics, languages, literary theory, criticism, dramatic arts, and the history of printing and publishing. That's all from the MLA website. According to the facts on that site, it currently contains, in 2018, more than 2.8 million records covering material in 60 languages. So really, if you're in literary studies and you haven't learned to start with the MLA for your scholarship, that's where you go. The indexers routinely check more than 6,000 journals, and you can download a spreadsheet of all the journal titles that are indexed from the fact page. I use Academic Search Complete as a good backup because it draws from so many disciplines. Tolkien studies is increasingly becoming multidisciplinary. For example, there's a whole field in tourism studies because fans go places and be tourists based on what they love. New Zealand's economy got a noticeable boom post-film, so that comes under Tolkien studies. So here are the search results. And the first sort of organization, this is what I want to look at. I did a sort of breakdown in terms of periods. So from 1952 to 2818, total, first year that there was an academic article published on Tolkien's Beowulf essays, we're at 2,800 publications. If you look just at 1952 to 1999, 1,004 publications. So we're looking at the first part of that. And then from 2000 to 2018, 1,796 publications. So that works out to an average increase of nearly 100 publications per year. MLA will also let you look at the type of publication. I mean, you know, you can search for just X or Y, but you can also say, okay, well, you see academic journals, books, book articles. There's some overlap between those two categories. Dissertation, abstracts, and editions. So that has a number of implications. Primarily, it is no longer possible to have claimed to read, even briefly, all of Tolkien scholarship in the MLA, not even if you limit it to peer-reviewed articles and books. You can look at the various decades. So for example, I went through it in my Parallels to Fair essay. I could list how many publications came out each year. And this wasn't the whole time because it took a while for the women to begin appealing. You can also pull up the top 50 subjects in your MLA search. What are the most popular subjects that have been written about on your search? And keep in mind that there are multiple search terms for every entry in the MLA. So you don't have just one, but you still see what are the most popular ones that are coming up. And starts with novel being the most popular, ends with Marchen or Marken, which of course is the German word for fairy tale. A lot of early Tolkien scholarship was done by the folklorists because he drew on folklore. And you can see sort of a range. You can see Lord of the Rings is a trilogy, fiction, The Hobbit. You can see a pedagogical approach. There's people writing about teaching Tolkien. Invented languages, 41 articles, probably a significant number of those by linguists. Old Norse literature. So you see all the major topics that are being written on with Tolkien. However, well, like I say, this is not exhaustive. It does give you a way to give a quick overview to what are some of the terms that are out there. And if any of those terms connect to something you're interested in, you can go look at that, specific search and get some more specific detail. Next, I took the top 10 subjects and I compared over what were the top 10 subjects in each 20-year period. How did it change over time? Again, you can sort of just look at that. People are not writing about C.S. Lewis as often with regard to Tolkien. He was, of course, they were best buddies for a while, and Narnia, and they were in the writing group together. So Tolkien scholarship overlaps with Inkling's scholarship, which involves Lewis and Raymond Williams and some of the others, and Charles Williams. So you can sort of see what has changed as we move toward the present, and what's coming up, what's dropping out. It's always worth looking at some of the older stuff if it fits with your areas of interest, because who knows what was said then? You may be able to bring something entirely new to it then. So this is not so much as they go, oh, I can toss all this out and don't have to read it. It's like, well, here's what I'm thinking about. Here's what I'm interested in. Do I need to look at this and see what was said? So sometimes it's not. Sometimes you'll just be surprised. Now, I did the great big, huge possibilities, the most popular ones. But of course, if you want to find out what is recently being done and doing the recent searches, you have to go and look for things that are too small in number to show up on the top, because it only shows you the top 50 terms. You know, one will just kill to get the top 100, but will MLA do that? No. Clearly, it's a programming problem. At that point, you sort of have to know what specific terms you're interested in. And obviously, these gaps that Droutman Wynn calls historical literary analysis or contemporary critical approaches are ones that I work with and so that I looked at. So, class as a subject heading with Tolkien as a subject heading. Only 5 articles, 2004 to 2011. We're not seeing an awful lot being done with class. Feminisms, feminist, all those possibilities with the little hashtag. 8, ranging from 1996 to 2015. Now, feminism is not limited, it's not for female characters. As I said, there are a lot of essays on female characters that are not feminist. And you know, you have to, especially for academic work, define what you mean by that. Fan studies, which is one of my areas. That's becoming very rapid very quickly. And 2004 is the year after Peter Jackson's live action film came out, after Tolkien fandom exploded across the internet. And there are a whole bunch of us working on that stuff. So 27 since 2004. Female characters as a subject, 19. Now, obviously, those will overlap with the 8 that are feminist, but specifically female characters, 2003 is the first one and 2015 is the most recent. Gender is a subject. And again, notice how these are all connected. Those imply what sort of theoretical approach. 13, again, 1996 to 2015. Homosexuality gets you 7. Queer, only 4. There's going to be an uptick because Jane Chance, one of the other 3 biggest Tolkiens, came out with Tolkien as a queer creature, which is actually the straightest queer theory book I've ever read. But there's an anthology planned in the works about queer studies and Tolkien, and so we're going to be pursuing that. And that is not automatically homosexuality, because queer as a theoretical perspective has its own sort of category. Race and women. So you can see by just looking at the numbers, and then if you compare those to the top ones, how these are fairly recent, fairly small, and although they've probably grown since last time. And I expect to see more work done in all of that, simply because I know Tolkien Studies of Popular Culture, which I run, some of the new journals that are coming out, new scholars, we're actively pursuing these things because these are the things that interest us. And unlike the first generation, and it's important to realize the people who created Tolkien Studies as a discipline are still alive. They've mostly just retired recently, and we're writing, spec scripts for them and sort of stuff. Their graduate students and other generations of scholars coming out, we're now doing the new stuff. And that is what scholarship is. Ideally, the people who come out are not just doing the same thing over and over again. Another way that Tolkien Studies is changing involves periodization. This is not going to be true for all sorts of literature, but Tolkien from the start was associated strongly with medieval and medievalism because he was a medievalist, because of the epic fantasy. Most of the people who published scholarship on Tolkien the first 50 years were medievalists. If they weren't medievalists, they were folklore. And so it's only recently that we've begun looking at Tolkien as a modern writer in conversation with modernity. there are obviously some different specialization. Medievalists have different training than modernists do, and then of course the postmodernists come in and throw everything for, up over end. So the shift from focusing on period and approaches associated with the period is changing. Plus you have this absolutely awesome term, which I'm seeing now, which is postmodern medievalism. Whoa. Because medievalism actually doesn't mean medieval studies. It's not Beowulf and Chaucer. Medievalism is something like Tolkien. Anything that is written after the Middle Ages that incorporates ideas about the Middle Ages from that later historical period. Game of Thrones is a medievalist text. Even though technically it's not, because the War of Roses, which is George R.R. Martin's big thing, was not medieval. But medievalists have given up expecting, good dating for people. It's perceived as medieval. It's perceived as the Dark Ages. So yes, all of these games that are set in sort of high fantasy areas, all these are medievalism. So you have a lot of medievalists now who have been trained, of course, at Chaucer and Beowulf and the others, now out there happily doing scholarship and Dungeons and Dragons, video games, and postmodern medievalism. It's a thing. In fact, there's scholarship claiming that Tolkien's texts are postmodern. Not Tolkien, but his texts. Because you have The Hobbit, you have The Lord of the Rings, you have the Silmarillion, and then you have all the earlier drafts, and they all connect. And if you want a good example of a postmodern text, that's Tolkien's Legendarium. So we'll probably be more of that happening. This is just the start. This sort of subject search does not result in the ability to say anything authoritative about the scholarship other than the kind of thing I said. And that's not debatable. Anybody else can do these subject searches. I mean, the numbers will change, but it'll be the same sort of thing. What you then have to move toward for bibliographic essay is that deeper, engaged reading. But before we leave this, I'd like to point out that spending time mousing around in the database is often resulted for me in the same sort of serendipitous results that I used to get when I'd wander around the library stacks looking for a book. And you go there, you're looking for a book, it's not there, but then you find, oh, look, here's this other one, because you're in that same area. When I was doing the work for this presentation, I found two books on, two articles that I had no idea existed on the topics I like, and I had to order by interlibrary loan. One is what appears to be the first publication on Tolkien and postmodernism, and the other is a review, a bibliographic review of published scholarship on medievalism that did not have bibliography in the subject term, which means that I had missed it. Somebody fell down on me.
Anybody recognize that problem in here?
Subject terms that are in the databases are not perfect. So that's why it can be useful to sort of, like I say, play around. Okay. I included an essay for you all because it's one I found a couple of years ago, and I'm giving it to all my graduate students I advise, and I am encouraging everybody in my graduate courses to read it. It's called Lessons on the Craft of Scholarly Reading, and it's by Jolie Jensen. And she talks about how you create a bibliography and then how you engage and how you read it for the project, on the very smart note that really we don't teach our students how to do scholarly reading. I mean, we sort of throw you all in and say, oh, go read the scholarship. And it's like, what? We don't spend a whole lot of time, at least I never have, and perhaps we should spend more on this idea of how you read scholarship. It's not the same way you read literature. I mean, it's just not. For one thing, you can't. It's not that I say, I don't fall into the literature is fun and easy and nice and scholarship is hard. And, when my students try and tell me that, I say, have you ever read Finnegan's Wake by James Joyce? Some parts of Tolkien's work. It is not, literature is not easy to read, but it's qualitatively different. So when you're doing scholarship, so she has phases, and I can really say, if you don't read it for this class, store it away for
I'm sorry,
Yep.
what was the name of the time?
Jolie Jensen, Lessons in the Craft of Scholarly Reading. I sent
It'll be.
Dr. Stewart a huge folder with everything.
Yeah, look in, under the, this week's unit and all, she sent lots and loads of stuff. It's all there.
It's all there. So. Now what that is my backup copy that I made from the internet publication, because I have learned that things do disappear off the internet. So whenever I get something I want students to read, I immediately make a backup copy. It's probably illegal, but don't tell anybody.
It's educational.
It's educational, fair use. And it is. So she describes phase 1 as gathering, and this is what I've just been talking about. To create a project bibliography, we need to define our chosen scholarly landscape. Where are its borders? What are its key features? Where are the controversies in our topic? We also need to understand how the current topic landscape came into being. Which thinkers, ideas, debates, and divisions gave rise to these particular borders, features, and controversies. You can get a basic sense of those by doing some of the searches I did today. To get a deeper sense of it, you have to pick what you're going to do and read it. That's sort of phase 2 in discovery, engaged in active reading of the sources most relevant to your topic. And this is where the annotated bibliographies come in, because there you focus on just summarizing and understanding your selected scholarship. You're not at this point trying to make an argument, although as you do this, hopefully ideas will come and, well, I want to punch this person in the face. Well, make a note of that. Maybe I can do so rhetorically later on. I have spent years wanting to rhetorically punch Harold Bloom for his stupid commentary on Tolkien's style. I don't do that. I just briefly cite him and then go on to prove it totally wrong by stylistic analysis. But yes, so you will be having ideas, but you're trying to summarize it. And having all those printed out and in front of you lets you look at that, because you cannot hold all this in your head. Lets you look at it and start seeing some of the patterns. And then you can, after you have accurately summarized what they're saying, look at the patterns and start thinking about what you were doing. This is where we move into the patch writing dilemma, the problem with that, because it sounds so easy to say, accurately and as neutrally as you can in tone, summarize the major arguments of the research. I mean, that's easy to say, right? Well, not that easy. It's got a bunch of polysyllabic words, but it's fairly easy to say. It is not easy to do. So this is actually how I distinguish between summary and paraphrase. When I use the term with my students, I say a summary is the overall major argument of the complete text. A paraphrase is like a mini summary of a part of that complete text. So they're both, the goal is summarizing. It's just what scope you're doing. So for example, for the journal assignment my class has, I'm asking them to look at one section in the introduction of our first theory book and then to paraphrase that. Not the whole book. I mean, eventually after you get good at this, you can summarize the major argument of whole books in a sentence or two. And you have to in your own research, because you can't spend all that time summarizing. But that's sneaky too, because it's usually the major argument that is most relevant to your topic that you are then going to engage in the rest of the book. But it is difficult. The difficulty of the academic standards for attributing, summarizing, and citing sources is often oversimplified to this very simplistic idea that plagiarism is bad. And this is, of course, what all the work that the composition people are doing is complicating. There's actually a lot of scholarship in psychology and some of the social sciences where they've actually studied students, and students all know that plagiarism is bad and wrong. But of course, the kicker in this is, what is plagiarism defined as? And that's where we get to our complex thing. Because intentional plagiarism, copying the Wikipedia article, copying and pasting it, turning it in, using your friend's essay, using your sister's essay, buying a paper from one of the many, 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 many paper mills that are online. That's one thing. We all know that's wrong, and our students know that's wrong. Even those who do it presumably know it's wrong because they try and hide it. There are strategies to address that in your teaching. And in fact, this issue of instructional weakness and patch writing, I think there's often an instructional cause for plagiarism. That is, if you do a very simplistic essay assignment and you do the same one every year and you never change it around and you don't have any sort of things that make it specific, you're just setting up a complete invitation for paper files and plagiarism, all of which existed pre-internet. The internet just makes it easier to prove it, that it happens. So I've spent time, my teaching life, developing project assignments for all of my courses that make that sort of thing harder to get around with. I first learned to do this my first time I was an instructor right after I got my PhD in an American Lit class, and there were all these really ghastly essays came in on who's that big American, Faulkner, the Faulkner essay we were reading. And I sort of stumbled around and I finally realized all the essays were copying arguments out of the cheat sheet, the cheat booklet. I forget what the term was, but the same argument. Cliff's Notes.
Yeah.
It's something else now.
Spark Notes.
Spark Notes, yeah. And I talked to some of the students and they really did not understand what they did was wrong. I mean, they read it, they explained it, it made sense, they then applied it, and they did it. So this is when I started thinking about this. So I have process approaches in my classes where I read a bunch of early writing, because if you then have the sudden, change, you know that. Prompts that are very specifically tied to assigned readings, many of which are pretty quirky, because I'm a pretty quirky kind of person. And graded research logs, approval of a certain number of secondary sources, and this is where it gets hard, changing the readings and assignments every time I teach. And in recent years, I've been sort of limiting, especially with this project I've been doing with plagiarism and patch writing and better teaching. I've actually not had students do their own independent research because I cannot read everything they find. So I set a certain number of sources and supply those. This actually came out, did you remember the really wonderful, wonderful student you had in 595 that you and I worked with, who was, I forget her name, and I wouldn't say it if I remembered it because of things, but she was in your 595 class, and it turned out, turned it in, flagged some stuff, and it turned out she'd been patch writing
For ages.
Forever. I had her in undergraduate and graduate courses, and those were when I had students find in their own research. I mean, I approved the sources they used, so I knew they were good peer-reviewed research, but I didn't read them. So, and she was a good writer, but she was patch writing.
She flawlessly patched wrote.
Right. But it was close enough that it picked it up, and if someone had tracked it down, and like I said, she was one of my best students ever, and she was great, and we were horrified, and we worked with her. And nobody blamed her. I blamed myself. So this is when I started saying, okay, I can't tell if a good student is patch writing. It's easy to tell when the weaker students or the less experienced students are patch writing. But when a good student and a good writer is doing it, I can't tell unless I know the sources that they are using intimately enough to recognize it. So, and that was one of the big wake-up calls that I had. So I've been doing that all along. And then one year, this was in 2013, I had a 70% rate of unintended plagiarism in my students' final projects. The numbers are actually perhaps slightly less horrifying in that there were only 10 students in the online class at that point, so 7 of 10.
That's that enough.
But it's still horrifying because 7 of 10 students, and one of them had done it in previous process writings, and I cautioned her, I'd warned her, I'd given her models, and she could not, did not, would not fix it. That student did fail the class. None of the others did, because I had a very specific policy that was not a one strike and you're out. It was like, I will help you, I will identify this problem, we will work together and solve it. But they hadn't had it in their process writing. And suddenly in their final essays, bam, there it was. And they were horrified. A whole bunch of them were, of course, this was undergraduate course, they were going to be teachers. I was horrified. They were good students. I asked them all to, and none of them failed the class because of it. A couple maybe went from an A to a B because of the grade. But I asked them for specific information. How did this happen? And the number one answer was carelessness and note-taking and rushing at the end to get their project in and not careful. Does this all sound very familiar? And we've all done it, and probably we've done it and it just didn't get caught. So,
Let me pause for a moment. Remember what I said about what do you do? It's finals week. You've just gotten all the finals turned in. You've got a lot of finals to grade, and so you're working right up to the deadline. What do you do when you find that patch-written text that comes from a student who's done fine? So, I mean, that's just one tiny issue that we deal with at the end of the semester, because it happens at the end of the semester, very common. Very common.
I'll point out that this was before the current policies we now have on academic dishonesty were enacted. How many of you have read the university
do we have
policies?
that? Is that in the?
It's in the folder.
I read that. I didn't realize that was material that you sent her. I thought this was stuff that you just uploaded.
Well, she did upload it.
So I got through half of them, but that was one of them that I read was the graduate.
There's a graduate and the undergraduate. They're substantially the same, except the graduate students get reported to the graduate school, and we're talking serious possibilities here. The undergraduates get reported to the provost and vice president for academic affairs. These look horrifying. I can attest, having filled out a few, that it is for the undergraduates. I've never done one for a graduate student, she says hastily. The bureaucratic bungling that takes place is such that I'm not sure anything bad could happen. And the one time a student appealed from one of my 341 classes, the dean in the science college overruled me. So yeah, I don't even do it anymore, but I caution students to realize that's out there. And they only have one little thing on plagiarism. I mean, they're cover a huge number of types of academic dishonesty. But I would encourage you to look at it. If you're teaching for us, and of course you're a graduate student in this program, here's what is here. But the situation with our really brilliant student, the situation with my incredibly traumatized class, led me to realize that I needed to do something differently. Because yeah, it was at the last minute. What do I do? Oh, I'll just make a note here too. Here and other universities, if you don't have a plagiarism policy in your syllabus, which you're supposed to have, that explains what you will do, you can't do anything. Were you here when the 14 students at Navarro got let graduate?
I think I came in the semester
After that. We had an early education program at Navarro, which is hours away and taught by people there. And it's been one of these partnerships and, whole long time. Anyway, in that one of the early education classes that was reading children's literature, were given like an annotated bibliography. 14 of them turned in the exact same document, and all of them copied the blurbs from the back of the books that they were covering. The teacher at Navarro, who had not been well enough taught or counseled by our department, did not have a plagiarism policy in her syllabus. She, of course, wanted legitimately to flunk them for plagiarism. They appealed and said nobody had ever taught them they couldn't do that. This went up the appeal chain, and I support the appeal chain. I just feel it's too bad that often the worst professors are never reported on from observation, but in this case it went up to the council that was over teacher education, and they approved the students to graduate. We graduated 14 early childhood teachers who thought it was okay to plagiarized an entire major assignment and got away with it.
And it was affirmed
Hmm?
because they got away with it.
Mhm.
Yes, and I came in and I was asked to teach that online 305. I had no idea what had gone on. I knew there'd been problems, but nobody would tell me.
Oh, you should have come and talked to me. I was about, Judy resigned from that. She was the one person on the committee that said no. She's a
Yeah.
historian.
I'd heard something about plagiarism, but I didn't know how it, yeah, okay. So I got
And
that class online.
Our templates for the,
Yeah.
for the program, they all have it.
nowadays they do.
Yeah,
Uh,
I'm struggling with
back-
amendments to it. Like-
But of course, this was before we had, this wasn't an online class, this was at Navarro, so it was before we had some of the things we have. At that point, the department head, I forget who was department head then, it was Jerry, I imagine,
Jerry?
Yeah.
Yes.
would require the people we hired at Navarro, who again worked full-time at Navarro, which was a community college, who were hired to teach our classes under this weird partnership thingy. And he would inspect their syllabi before they were released. And then we've taken steps since. But yeah, but again, syllabus is a legal contract. The templates, if you use the templates, I know certain people who are not, I shall not name names here. But I replaced the template one with my own because it's kind of unique. But yes, you cannot do anything as a teacher if you don't have it in your syllabus. So, okay, so as a result of the problems, I said I've got to do something. I went out and did research. I'm not a composition person, and the majority of work in English is done by the composition people, Rebecca Moore Howard. But I created and piloted an anti-plagiarism unit in a 200-level class. This was a 2-week sequence, which consisted of informational handouts and text lectures, links to online resources, including a Rate Your Knowledge of Plagiarism quiz, practice quizzes, multiple choice questions, and e-college. A test bank of multiple choice questions for an anti-plagiarism exam, and some other stuff. From that, I developed a unit I called the Plagiarism Prevention Project, PPP, because you have to have a cool acronym, right? For years, which was intended to address the growing incidence of inadvertent or unintentional plagiarism at the university level. The plagiarism, intentional is a different. Official disclaimer. I do not deal in the materials that I have specifically with the needs of international ESL students because I simply don't have the training in that. This is a gap. Dr. Chang, I know, has worked in that plagiarism with international and or ESL students. So at some point it would be really neat if we could talk and do that. Something I like to make clear, because otherwise it does come across that way. I am not blaming high school teachers. If I were going to blame anybody, it would be the Texas legislature, but that's another issue. Or composition teachers, or teachers at all. Because, like I say, my students. If I'm going to blame teachers for not teaching serious students, I'm right in there with them. I wasn't teaching them. And what has happened over the years since I started doing that is just how complex this is. But my basic principle is I can no longer simply tell my students not to plagiarize without teaching them what I mean by plagiarism and explaining all this information, and then fail them, either whether it's a failed paper or the failed class, because it does nothing to solve anything. And the types of unintentional plagiarism I was most aware of at the time when I started this were summarizing or paraphrasing a secondary source that is listed on the works cited page, but not clearly attributed in the text, or does not have correct or insufficient to meet MLA standards. Parenthetical attribution, where an author's name is stuck at the end of a long paragraph with no clear distinction made between what the student is saying and what the source is saying. It's all jumbled together. I mean, you can sort of figure it if you read it carefully, but it's not clear. Errors in the use of quotation marks, of course, that are the easiest ones. Sloppy note-taking, cutting, pasting at the end of term, being rushed, exhausted at the end of term, or just simply not understanding how to do it. heightened by over-reliance on quotation. And I see this over-reliance on quotation at all levels. I get articles that I read for the Journal of Tolkien Research, which is our online peer-reviewed Tolkien Studies journal, that, and there's actually a term of patch quoting or whatever, that can simply consist of quotes scattered throughout every paragraph. There can be 8, 10, 12 quotes per page with a few sentences tucked in around them. It's I will sort of come up with an argument and then I'll dump every quote I can find in it. And it's like, no, that's not what you want to do. In fact, I now have the term for it from one of the articles I gave Susan to give to you all. Is called Skimming the Surface, which is a newspaper report for a higher ed journal about Rebecca Moore Howard and Sandra Jamison's presentation at the 4 Cs, where they reported on the early results of the citation project. Because what they did was collect 164 student essays from first-year comp courses all around the country, community college to Ivy League. They found the same problems in all of them. The community colleges are not worse than the Ivy League ones. And they coded them all for how did students use their sources. They got over 1,800 individual citations from those 164 pages. Then they did have a team, by the way, of 20 researchers, so this is how they could do it. They looked at all the sources to identify direct quotes, plagiarism, summary, and they define summary minimally. The ability to summarize in a sentence or so content that was in at least 3 sentences worth of the text. And then they studied. And the reports, which are summarized in this article, which is what I always give for the DDES pretest, so students read this at the beginning of the semester, are that students read short articles. These are all ones they found themselves. They only quoted or paraphrased or patch wrote from the first page or 2 of the article, so there was nothing indicating they had finished the article. And 44% were like copy and paste plagiarism. I mean, they had all sorts of data on how students actually refer to sources. And yet, despite all of that, they're saying it's not the students' fault, it's not the fault of the internet, it is how plagiarism is taught. It lacks nuances in terms of that. So skimming the surface, this is what I call when you just go through and grab out some quotes, grab them out of context and drop them in. And it happens, as I say, at all levels. And that might be something to do on an early note-taking stage. It certainly shouldn't be the final draft. So, and then Rebecca Moore Howard, by looking at all this, is coming out with the argument we were talking about before class. Patch writing is a natural step toward moving from quotation to engaging with the ideas to summarizing it. So after doing that, and I must credit Dr. Boland for alerting me to the citation project, I realized that I needed to build room for that process and not penalize students at those earlier ones. So these are now, and I changed the name of the project because calling it the Plagiarism Prevention Project got everybody focused on plagiarism and in fact terror struck by plagiarism. But you can have content that's completely correctly attributed and not patch writing, and it's still skimming the surface. It is still not engaging with what is being studied, and students are not able to make an original argument. So plagiarism is a part of it. These are the students who've not been taught enough or learned enough on their own to do it, but skimming the surface is the big problem. If we can fix the bigger problem along with helping, we can do that. And this really emphasizes the fact that many good students patch write very, very well, but are still stuck at a more, because I remember she had a really hard time getting to an argument because she was so used to flawlessly reproducing the arguments from the scholarship. But if you know that those arguments all come from someone else and you say, well, what's your argument? It was,
Yeah.
and she's not alone. I mean, what I saw a lot of the 599s and 595s is that leap to getting to that original. And it happens when I advise thesis students and dissertation students. They have the scholarship. They can talk forever about what everybody said. Okay, what do you have to say that's new? It's hard. So that's something to remember.
And I will remark on that gap reading. It's really hard to find what's not there if you're not trained in it. To look for what's absent is very difficult at times. It's not so bad when you go in with an idea and say, I wonder if this has been written about, and you've already identified a gap. But when you're in this process of, what am I gonna argue?
Yeah, well, this is why, I mean, especially, yes, your thesis or your dissertation or your 595 paper, you're supposed to sort of be doing a great deal on your own, but you have to have an advisor who knows it well enough, who can sort of guide you and point you to some of the places. Although it does have to be something you learn, because once you graduate and go out on your own, then you have to do all this. If you're continuing teaching at the level where you have to do research, you have to figure it out. And goodness knows, it took me quite a few years. And if I hadn't been teaching theory courses, I'm not sure I would ever have gotten there.
What does DDES stand for?
Diving deep and engaging with sources. I am hopping from skimming the surface, skimming the surface. Not good. We want to dive deep and engage with sources. And it takes, for example, if you read Skimming the Surface very carefully, when my students try and summarize that in one sentence, they say, students plagiarize. And like, no, that's not the main argument of the piece. It is much more broad in terms of the trouble they have with engaging with sources, and the solution to the problem is teaching. So yes, if you just skim that article quickly, you come away thinking it's plagiarism because we're all trained to go to that. And I realized by calling it the PPP, I was enforcing that. So now I call it diving deep and engaging with sources. But when we were talking in the center the other day, Diana was working with one of my students last semester, and the student kept saying, Doctor, we keep saying it's plagiarism, and Diana's going, I don't see plagiarism. What was probably happening is it wasn't plagiarism, but it wasn't meeting the DDES criteria. It can be not plagiarism. Not plagiarism is necessary, but not sufficient for a good summary.
Quite a few students also tripped up on the plagiarizing factual information.
That is actually what I'm talking about tonight, because yeah, I was talking with you guys the other day. I said, I should especially spend some more time. This is just a handout of all the diving deep and engaging with sources materials that you guys have. And that I've used, and this reflects the current iteration of things. This was developed with the help of a fellowship from whatever your center was called before it became your center.
Center for Faculty Excellence and Innovation.
That one.
Or Faculty Center for Teaching.
That one, where the provost was throwing some money at you guys. So I got a fellowship there. It was great. That means all of this material is available to anyone who wants to use it. And some of in my graduate courses, I tell the student, undergraduates, if they're going to be teachers, if you want to take this and use it and work with it and improve it, you're welcome. So it's all free. I don't even have my name on these handouts. I mean, I use them in all the classes, but yeah, feel free to take them. So these are the various handouts. These have actually grown in the last couple of years. Because we assess our student learning outcomes every year, I've been able to track this. So I can say that I've gone from classes where, depending on the class, anywhere from 20 to 50% of the students show inadvertent plagiarism on their pretest, which is done in the first week or two, to all of a sudden, every student in my classes is showing these to vary, some more than others, but it's that patch writing. It's the patch writing that's the real problem, not the other stuff. And the factual information thing is the one thing I realized, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So, as I said, I had never heard of this. I have been reading a lot about it. It's very complex. I know that I used to do it in sort of my process. So I have to say, it is not intentional. You are trying to get there. For right now, let's just say it is the too close but not exact copying of content with a source. It can even be attributed in the sense of so-and-so said blah, 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 blah. but it's still patch writing because it's too close to the language of the original source. And of course, if there's no attribution, it then sort of starts getting closer to plagiarism, because at that point, well, if you've not clearly indicated it's from a source, you're presenting it as your argument. And students don't always realize they're doing that, but I've actually had students present an argument from an essay they read about, last fall I was doing multi-ethnic comic books, an article they read about, Miles Morales, Spider-Man, as their own argument. And it's like, you read this essay and you could use it, but attribute it. And so, yeah. The copying often involves taking the keywords or phrases. And again, you do have to use those keywords and rearranging them. The problem is they do it, but they don't keep revising it. They don't keep working with it. So these are all the materials. You are free to use them. I've been giving them to the Writing Center to use in the handouts. And tonight, especially after meeting with the tutors last week, I'm going to talk about one of the specific ones that was written after I realized the pattern I was seeing across my classes with so many of my students, plagiarizing factual information. Because how many of you heard you don't need to attribute facts?
Well-known facts.
Huh? Well-known facts. Common knowledge.
Right.
Christopher Columbus, yeah, okay. Well, that's got a few stings in its tail. So first, this is the formula. One of the things I've done, because I'm grading their summaries, is do instructions and criteria. This is like, as is for the 341's technical writings, annotated bibliographies. This is what you write when you write an annotated bibliography in my class. The other classes that are literature, they do their summaries in their journals or their discussions. I have a whole lecture on the modified criteria, because when you do it in an essay, you don't follow this lockstep formula. But since students don't know how to do it, my hope is that by having a formula, they will internalize what the key elements are, and then you just compress it and synthesize. So I set a certain word limit for the summaries. You have to start with.
Can I say something?
Yes.
Remember when I made you do really short stuff? That's why.
Okay. My fault. No, I mean, when you do abstracts and proposals and that, you have to do short stuff. Or if you're on the job market, you have to have a 30-second elevator speech summing your whole dissertation for the dean. You just have to get practice done. So start with full attribution and brief, relevant contextual information. One of the things that Howard and Jameson reported is that students will just drop quotes in without paying any attention to the context. Where did this come from? They don't even introduce them. They don't even do the quote sandwich. Just pop, quote. I have colleagues who actually teach science fiction, and we hang out on Facebook together. They've gotten plagiarism of their own articles from their students who apparently didn't realize, because they don't look at the context, it was by the same dude was teaching their class. Brief, and note here, brief, relevant contextual information. Summarize the major overall argument using argue as the main verb, or argues in the case of plural authors. So really, these first 3 bullet points are within the first 2 to 3 sentences. Top down, going that. One of the hardest things I have is getting students to use the verb argue. They discuss, they explain, they talk about, they say that people do everything in the student's rhetoric except argue. Probably because it has such a negative connotation, but this is what we're talking about. Be written in your own words without quotes to dismiss that summary to quote. You can use quotes in papers in my class, but you have to introduce them and analyze them. You can't replace a summary with a quote. Be written in formal style. Start with the most important arguments rather than copying the structure. Most early ones, they simply go through and copy the structure and put an MLA 8 citation. Avoid personal commentary or evaluative language. So that's what they're looking for. So what I realized is in the vast majority of my pretest across all my classes, students were copying certain phrases over and over and over again. It's just like almost every pretest. And it was the information that gave what I had sort of identified for them would be considered the brief, relevant contextual information. In this case, it is the credentials of Howard and Jameson. The article is a reporter writing about it. So all the arguments in the essay and the article are Howard and Jameson's. Barrett really does not have an argument because it's not an opinion piece. This is what they said, da, 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 da. So here are paragraphs 2 and 3 from the original article. We see the rank, area, and where she works. So that is something that, you know, I point out to them. This is what you have to do. And yet I would get time after time after time, those almost exact words. And when I pointed out it was inadvertent plagiarism, I got questions, and I compressed them for the handout on plagiarizing factual information. If listing what their degrees are and where they got it from verbatim is considered patch writing, how do I correctly give their credentials without it being considered patch writing? Those are their credentials, and I don't know how to convey that any other way. This was probably one of my computer science majors. But I heard it from a lot of students, including ones in humanities. This question implies that the students have the idea that copying the language of a factual statement isn't plagiarism because that's just their credentials. And the answer is, of course, even if it is a fact or common knowledge, copying the exact language of a source is part of the textbook definition of plagiarism. Now, and you can't put it in quotes. So I assumed, well, I didn't put it in quotes because we can't use quotes. I said, well, if you put a direct quote in without quotation marks, that's also plagiarism. So my students are going, stuck. Can't get out of this incredibly endless loop.
It is a tough one, though. I mean,
It is a tough one.
Taught, I mean, there's kind of a right way and a wrong way to frame this kind of information. And you either do it right or you do this weird kind of patch writing exercise to prevent copying word for word what happened.
Or you know, you use
what was said. Sorry.
program online that apparently patch writes for you, which I realized one of my students in tech writing used because the word understudy appeared in their annotation of a computer science article.
Well, and I'd like to speak to this a little bit. I wonder what part of that is actually necessary. An associate professor?
Hey, you're stepping on my lines.
Oh, sorry.
You're, spoiler alert.
Never mind.
Bad. But before we get to that, part of the problem is what common knowledge is. I mean, students always use the word fact. They don't use the phrase common knowledge. Academics always use the word common knowledge. And common knowledge isn't necessarily a fact. Overlap a lot, but not necessarily. So I give my students now 2 sources on this handout. This is what we define as common knowledge. Basically, simply, let's just define it as information that most people in a specific group or culture, because only in the US would you not have to footnote Christopher Columbus discovered blah, blah, blah in this time. Anywhere else in the world, it probably is not necessarily common knowledge.
And it's arguable.
And it's arguable if you wanted, but I mean, still, this guy that we sort of call this arrived in this place that was not in fact America in this year, according to the Christian calendar. But for now to say, define it as information that most people would know without looking it up, whatever your group or culture is. There's no way that these 2 scholars' academic credentials and place of employment would be considered common knowledge any place outside their universities. And as I ask my students, did you know this before? No. Well, then it's not common knowledge. And P.S. always over attribute because that's not a major error. Under attributing is. But yes, it's exactly what you said. The problem is they don't take the time to do more than just shove that in. So they just need to learn that you really can't lift entire phrases from the course, from a source. They have to think about the type of information, the audience they're writing for, and the assignment requirements, which by the way include brief and concise, to select the most relevant information and rephrase it usually more concisely than in the original. Because that's one thing about patch writing, it's not more concise than the original. So as I said at the start, I'm not blaming people, but I had to give my students something to explain to them so I didn't have to keep doing it email by email by email. So I gave them example of plagiarism. That's the first one. And these are all things that I wrote, but I know the kind of things I've been seeing from my students, so they're obviously affected by it. The bolded phrases are copied word from word and are presented in the exact same order. That's another tip-off for some kinds of patch writing. Everything is in the same sentence structure. Sometimes they switch the sentence, beginning and end of sentences, but overall you'll have the same structure. And then I give one example of patch writing. The bolded phrases use some, but not all the words from the 2 paragraphs, change the order of the words in the phrases slightly, but keep them in the same order, Rebecca Moore Howard and Sandra Jamison, as in the original. Second patch writing example. The bolded phrases, again, use some, but not all of the words, and they actually change up the order a little bit more. So it's getting further from the original. If you just kept going, you could eventually get out of patch writing. The third one, same thing. Well, you see that we still see some of these specifics. They're giving less specifics. And then I gave my students examples of 2 paraphrases, which I wrote, and said, this is a paraphrase in my own words. Now, remember, this would be like the second sentence of a summary paragraph, so the attribution has been given. So Dan Barrett, Skimming the Surface, Inside Higher Education, reported on this conference, bam. And here it is. So I don't need the attribution in this sentence. It's already in the paragraph. The first paraphrase starts with their names together and identifies their disciplinary and university status. They're not high school teachers, nor are they physics teachers. The most important information is not where they work at the university or their rank, but that they're working in composition studies. See, I said you were going for my line. Who research and teach composition at the university level have analyzed student essays. That's the contextual information for their argument. Now, of course, my students always want to cram the paragraph full of 164 and 85 and all this other stuff, but they're supposed to focus on the arguments, not the evidence. And then this one, 2 university researchers in English, Rebecca Moore Howard and Sandra Jamison, direct the citation project. I actually consider that a little less useful a paraphrase because unless you know what the citation project is, that isn't going to help you, but it's still acceptable. The names of the universities where they work are not as important as their academic fields. And that is just the question of thinking hard enough about what is important. Mike, did you have a? No.
He always looks like that.
Oh.
Well, I was just gonna say about the universities, there is a level of prestige attached to them, right?
Sure there
So I
is.
mean, if I was saying Howard was from Whitehead Valley Community College of Montana versus Yale.
But you have 100, 150 words.
Sure.
There is prestige. And if you were writing, in for a higher sort of level audience in undergraduate classes or this sort of thing, it really, and if you had room with your other things, if you wanted to say that. But how many people know about the prestige? This is where you have to be writing for the academic audience. So I still will never forget one summer abroad, I was at Oxford and my professor recommended I go, quote, read this book by so-and-so who's a professor at one of your little American universities. I think they call it Harvard. Well, yeah. So, yeah. So, writing a brief paraphrase of the relevant contextual information about these authors really requires active thinking. What is the most important? To contextualize their argument about how students use writing. And I think this factual plagiarism, I call it factual plagiarism because this covers, the contextual information is sort of factual, but it covers all that common knowledge thing. And I focus on it because this isn't even talking about the argument, identifying the major argument. This is basic information that is in the first part of the very short article, and the vast majority of my students couldn't do it without patch writing and or plagiarism. So we're really to meet them where they start, they need this. Now, of course, they don't pay much attention to these handouts at the start until they get their pre-tests back and a few other things. One of my students in one of my final assignments is always a self-assessment. And also, what advice would you give, what advice would you have given yourself at the beginning of the semester if you knew then what you knew now? And I'm thinking of taking that out and putting it in one of the handouts with an anonymous student in this thing, because the student said, I would tell myself to pay a lot more attention to the DDES requirements. I didn't do it until too late, and it was sort of too late. So it's hard. If as teachers you're thinking, good grief, what can I do? I mean, one, feel free to take all my sources, but realize there are many good resources out there, and there are also some bad ones. You might remember when I first did the PPP, there was a mention of quizzes. And I thought, well, I'll make these quizzes and some of them will be correct attribution and the students can see it on the quizzes, then they'll be able to do it. They don't. And worse, I went out and took, because if you go online and search for plagiarism, all these universities that, like us, have these draconian policies, put up, and have more money to spend on this, put up elaborate resources on the topic of how to use sources. I mean, they're really quite admirable in many ways. And Sarah Northam in the library was working on a project to make a library guide for all of that stuff. But a bunch of them are quizzes created by different people. And I took a bunch of them and I flunked a bunch of them.
The quizzes are wrong. Yes.
Well, these are by people in psychology.
Oh, okay.
And that's where we get into APA, MLA, Turabian, and also, I am old enough to be honest, all of us as instructors have our pet peeves and obsessions that we layer onto. I draw obviously on the MLA, even though I have not yet internalized the bloody 8 version, and it's
working
just
on it.
confusing. But I also add my own things there. For me, I put some things in there that you could argue are not purely an MLA, especially the 8th edition, because I think it's useful. Again, especially this contextual information. Years ago, I had a student doing online research on an essay about Black athletes in sports for her 102 class. And I was walking around, this was in the lab, and they were doing it under my direction at the computers, and I walked around. She found a site by David Duke, a webpage by David Duke on Black athletes, Black basketball players. And she was ready to use it and take it, and I said, do you know who David Duke is? No? Google, this was the 90s, yeah. I said, maybe early 2000s, somebody got that. I said, Google David Duke. And she looked at it, and she was like, okay, not using him. But again, yeah, we can say, I'll always check to see who the source is. And yet, how many of our students come in and report they've been told, don't use Wikipedia, don't use internet sources? The idea is somehow they haven't, we have to teach them to evaluate the internet sources, which is another huge thing. But yeah, so they don't always, so I really push them to look at the context, and that goes to this, a prestigious university, a peer-reviewed journal. If someone is in psychology writing about Tolkien, I might mention they're coming at it from a psychology because that is a disciplinary issue. So a little bit of relevant, brief context is a very good part of it rather than just dropping in chunks of information. The Purdue OWL, which if you don't know, many of us do, is one of the best resources ever. They just did a huge site redesign and new stuff. This URL will take you to a huge number of resources they've developed for teachers where it's like, this is a 50-minute class exercise. I mean, they give you the instructions, they give you it all laid out for students to talk about what common knowledge means. I mean, they have a whole series of exercises about this that you could choose from, adapt, and then Creative Commons, they make it free for using. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel if you decide you want to start doing things. And I know, because I talked to Dr. Pauzek, that for composition, she has stuff that they do that in our classes. But once you get out of the composition classes, and if you're teaching other classes on your own, there may be things that would be useful. So I I become almost evangelical about this because I think more of us need to address this. And it's not just in the composition classes or the research and methods classes. It's in all the classes. Because if you only do it in one class and then expect students to use it forever, yeah, why should they? If they don't have to, they won't. Like I said, I realized I was just lucky enough to get through and manage to get to a level where I could write in more of my own words and make it clear and not get caught, so that I am not interested in punishing students. In fact, I've now completely revised the plagiarism policy I have that allows students, that there are penalties on individual papers or assignments, but I have a policy that anything that has inadvertent plagiarism can be revised once for full credit up until the very last minute. It does not, unless there is intentional, obvious plagiarism, which, by the way, I don't see all that much of. Over 99% of what I see, it's inadvertent. They can revise. That means that does put the process, the emphasis on them to revise. But if they revise, I send stuff to the writing center, I send students to get them to learn how to do this, so they go on, because that's the goal, is to teach them rather than to punish them. So, okay, thank you so much. Any questions?
Yeah, good time for questions.
Yeah, I tried to keep it, I wouldn't say short exactly, but shorter than it could have been.
Greg, you have anything to say? Abigail?
Oh, just enjoy the insight on that. It brought some clarity to some things, so I appreciate it.
Oh, thank you.
So question, we do work with, for 1302, forms that have models. Which is difficult to teach because these are not the first consent forms that have been written in the history of man, and they follow a model, and there's no citation in the examples in the book, right? But they came from somewhere. So at what point is a model like that something you have to attribute, right? Yeah. That's a better way to go with what you said. Because I'm having trouble, like.
And my syllabus, I've copied and pasted from the template because that's what I'm told to do.
Well, and there is this category called boilerplate.
Yeah.
I mean, one of my extra credit things in my online classes, since I can't always send them as a group to whatever, is if they find errors in my handouts and report them, they get extra credit. But I exempt all the boilerplate because I am not responsible for that stuff. And some of it is legal. That is, the anti-discrimination statement we have was vetted by the university lawyer. I can't change it. I don't think that has any errors in it, but I mean, as far as I'm concerned, the boilerplate that comes from the university, from the powers that be, that says you will use that, I'm not going to change it, even if I think it sucks. So actually, I heard a great presentation. We brought in a speaker. This is one of the people who did all the research to prove Turnitin et al. Are miserable, and a human being using Google is good. That's how you can actually prove these issues. And she said there's actually huge hypocrisy in academia because we have all this catalog, descriptions, syllabi, boilerplate, all these things. I mean, we just copy and paste stuff all the time without ever attributing it. So we just reserve this status to, like peer-reviewed scholarship. But arguably, a lot, I mean, I don't know, because I haven't ever taught the 1302 with the ethnographic. I don't know if these were, I mean, many scholars who create things, like I now have some stuff going on in SurveyMonkey, and they create survey questions and they make it free to anyone who's using the site to use them. So many people make this material, like I'm making the stuff here, available to you. You can change it, adapt it, revise it, whatever, or you can just take all this stuff and use it as written. I don't, I'm making it free to you. So unless I knew a specific case, or, I might Google some of the form language.
It's easy to see what's missing from it based on your, like, if you're doing if you're interviewing someone and you're recording it on a phone, what are you gonna do with that data? How long are you gonna store it? It's easy to add to it, but large sections of it, like the existence of using a pseudonym and changing your name, like these are phrases that.
From my time on IRB, because our university publishes examples of consent forms, as do all the IRBs at universities, I would imagine that consent forms, they're presented as models and laid out. These are like legal boilerplate people can use and adapt. And I think the common idea in this specific example is this is language that has been tested and evaluated by the professionals working in these
Professionals
fields.
and legal.
Professional and legal, and often changes. I mean, there's been a whole bunch of change in IRB questions relating to internet research. Because if you go to a fan community, if you join a private fan group under your fan name and you're secretly setting them and write scholarship on them without their permission, you have really screwed up ethically in terms of human subjects. And people don't think that about the internet because they think, it's the internet, everything's, it's okay. But yes, so there's an Association of Internet Researchers that has been updating all of the IRB stuff with regard to ethics applied to internet. So I don't think this would count as what we would consider plagiarism.
I call it, in our instances, academic comments.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Greg.
I'm sorry, I didn't interrupt. I also wanted to comment that you made about the going back and forth with the MLA in the Arabian. I find that has been a struggle for me. I have my master's in history, so we use Arabian. Then my doctorate in education, where we used A10. Now the ML. So I find trying to get a handle on all. So I appreciate you pointing that out. It makes sense in my head after you said it.
Yeah. And I mean, I make jokes, and there's a comic about it being like gangs, but yeah. I mean, the only thing that people who use MLA and historians who use Chicago agree on is we hate APA. Everything else is up for grabs. So.
Some other thoughts about,
Thoughts, questions, observations?
Patchwriting is such an interesting concept because I am a secondary teacher, and so we have what we call mentor texts all the time. We're like, use these writers, look at what they do, and then attempt that yourself. Use these texts and try. We encourage patch writing, but if that's all we ever do, then we are kind of setting them up for disaster.
Instead of considering using it as a process and developmental tool.
Right.
That
So
is to get you someplace else.
And that's what I've really been thinking about as we've been through this whole process. Like, I know for sure that I've taught them how to patch write, but like, have I made as concentrated of an effort to teach them to move beyond patch writing? I don't think
It's hard. And I realized, students will often ask me for a model of one of my assignments so they can use that to see what they're supposed to do. The last time I did that, actually it was one of Terry's essays from the 399, I put up as a model. And as a result of students using that, I got 5 students plagiarizing. For different reasons, but it's like, okay, if you give students who are not experienced, sophisticated readers and writers a model, they try to copy it word for word.
right.
So now, usually I don't have things from previous classes because, like I say, I can't change it every time. But like for my tech writing class, where they're doing annotated bibliographies, and their annotated bibliographies are on sources I've approved. They're professional organizations in their field, because this is about professionalism and professional skills, and then 8 articles that say, here are the professional and marketable skills. You'll be glad to know that all the computer science majors these days are being told to learn how to write. That writing is absolutely necessary because there's such a glut of computer science majors. You can't just walk into any job these days. Now, how the computer science department on our campus handles this is by assigning them to take English 341 as a major requirement. I have a model of how to write a summary of an organization, because you have to study what are the benefits, resources that members are offered, what are the types of membership, how much do they cost, can students become members, do they have any resources for members? This is the information you need to know about these professional organizations. I mean, some of them have big scholarships for students, computer science. The law organizations have amazing resources for law students, and yet the DDES summary requirements that I put up to you, those are for persuasive arguments, so you can't follow that one. So I give them a model of how to write a summary for an annotation for an organization, of how to do it. I use psychology because I almost never get a psychology major in 341. I had one time. So this is, okay, here's that. So they have a model to follow where they can't copy the content because it's psychology, but actually they could copy it pretty much. I would not complain if they copied some of the phrases like, this organization is, services offered are, this is organization language. It's pretty boilerplate. It would improve, copied it more. I have maybe 3 students in a class who even show any evidence that they looked at the model and tried to follow it. The others just jump right in and start writing.
And that's what I've done in any of the composition classes that I've taught. Is if my freshmen are writing essay where they have to explain the definition of true friendship or something delightfully ambiguous like that, then I will have one like explaining the definition of success. And so I'll write on success. They have to write on friendship, and so they can see the layout. But then I'm like, so I'm not stealing any of your ideas, right? So
so you're asking them to look at it and see, how do you write? How do you set it up? How do you introduce it?
Right.
Yes. Jump right in.
I guess for me, my question is, so with a bibliographic essay where you spend in more time, because to me that's paraphrasing. So because you're not necessarily making an argument though you may have an argument like in the way you choose your sources, how do you kind of go about paraphrasing without, or giving that summary without taking from that source? Because it's about that source. Does that make sense?
Okay. Well, no, a summary, in my definition of the DDES criteria, a summary is supposed to describe, but as I say, you do it postmodernist, no such thing as objectivity, but you are striving for a neutral tone and to be as accurate as possible in your summary. So yes, you do summarize the argument of the sources you're doing. The essay as a whole, though, but I mean, this is true even in a standard research paper. The body paragraphs have your evidence from your sources. Where is your argument in that paper? It's in the introductory section, and ideally, it's in the topic sentences where you explain how the evidence relates to the argument. So a bibliographic essay, well, some of them are very, and I gave you one of the year in Tolkien studies, which I participate in. That's a very basic one. Here's the summary, and then at the start, here are the topics that are being written about. And then there's a teeny bit of evaluation. I get really grumpy. Did not read these sources on this topic that they're writing about. And that's pretty bare bones. But in the perilous and fair essay, I make a larger argument about here's how the scholarship has changed over time. And at the end, I do exactly what Drought and Wind did. I was saying, this is what the scholars in future need to do. This is like the uber bibliographic essay where you're saying, okay, guys, do it right or don't do it at all. Now, this could, of course, be completely ignored, but it's just fun to inhabit that. So sometimes, I encourage people to look at these different things because it's the same thing that we give our students models. We're used to reading our scholarship to learn what they're saying. At some point, it's useful to step back and say, okay, how did they write their introduction? How did they set up their terms? Where is their review of literature? What do they put in a discursive footnote as opposed to in the text itself? I'm not talking about bibliographic footnotes. I'm talking about the little, or endnotes, excuse me. The discursive notes where you add information that isn't considered important enough. And sometimes there's fast. I got one idea for a whole essay from what I consider a really stupid comment buried in a footnote, an endnote on a fan studies journal that made an absolutely ridiculous claim about how, I think it was like Australian and British fan fiction writers wrote all that BDSM and torture fic stuff while Americans wrote good, clean, whatever. And I looked at that and it was buried in an endnote. I looked at this, I said, excuse me? Maybe this was true when you were doing this essay all this time ago, but I can point to all this stuff in Fanfic. So read the notes. Not when you're first deciding whether or not to use it, but you'd be surprised.
So interesting.
What people can get into those and sometimes what you can find. Plus they can be very useful and educational and all that other stuff. They can often reference sources or give you more information about a source and I've got to go get that now. So yeah.
One could do a study of endnotes in a journal.
I actually have a book on the history of footnotes. Historians have studied the history of when footnotes became important.
Yeah.
And of course, endnotes came in because doing footnotes in terms of setting pages before computers and stuff was an absolute bear. Footnotes are still better. Well, you can look right down the foot of the page and read it. You don't have to flip to the back and look at it.
The entire time.
Huh? Well, sometimes I'll flip back and forth, and sometimes I just say screw it and read the whole set of endnotes, go back and read the essay, and then read all the endnotes again.
I put a sticky note.
Sticky notes are good.
For the ones where the footnotes or the endnotes start, so I can so I don't have to dig for it every time.
Yeah, but when you're reading a book, there's like every chapter like that.
Yeah.
So, but we all have all our reading strategies. The important thing is to do the reading strategies.
Yes.
But yes, what you're doing in when you're summarizing for an annotated bibliography or for a bibliographic essay is your goal is to accurately and neutrally summarize. And the hard part is when you really totally disagree with this absolutely ridiculous argument and you're planning on eviscerating them in your essay to come. But the goal is to be able to fairly summarize, because that will win you big ethos points in an essay. If you are able to give it, to be absolutely fair to this argument, here's what it is. And then, here's how wrong they are. That's the subtext.
So save the rhetorical punch for later.
Mm-hmm.
That's when it's hard.
Well, and this is something that I had to almost have beaten into me. As you may guess from my verbal presentation, I tend to go for hyperbole and extremes. So developing that slightly more distanced tone, especially because I do feminist and on all these areas, and of course, even white women can be dismissed as the angry white women. Women of color are even more likely, if they have language that evokes the stereotype, to be dismissed. So it can be very hard. Actually, I consider one of my greatest victories was an essay I wrote on Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings film, which I loved, and many Tolkienists hated. There's all sorts of interesting stuff there, and I've been debating them verbally for years. And it was an analysis of the song at the end of the third film, Into the West, where I argued that the ending of the film is much more optimistic than the ending of the book. But when you listen to the song, Annie Lennox, who isn't listening to it, the imagery in the song picks up the imagery at the end of the book, the ship sailing, and this complex, and blah, 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 blah. And when I finished, someone in the back row was saying, well, I never saw that in that film, and which I don't like, but I admit I only watched it once on TV, and now I'm going to have to go look at it again because you might have something. I was going. Well, of course, the extended edition was great, but even with the limited, the theatrical release, film studies is a bit of a pain because they consider the theatrical one canon.
Ooh, that's so sad.
You want to duke it out with Dr. I write on the extended edition, but I mean, you always make it clear, and you have to talk about that. But yeah, now if I'd gone all sort of nuclear, and this was a verbal presentation that I later wrote in this, if I'd gone all nuclear, like, oh, idiots who can't understand how brilliant this is, people don't sit there going, but this way, so I'm going, that's what you're aiming at. You never convince people who are totally in complete opposition to you. But there's obviously a large audience who haven't made up their mind, and quite a few people you can convince, not to change their mind, but maybe there's something there. And I consider that a victory.
That MLA search you mentioned, you run that through the library?
Which one? Oh yeah, just on the database.
It's one of our databases.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes,
and
remember.
Yeah, the MLA International Bibliography.
Remember when I start out with a certain database and then I added databases, MLA.
One of those, okay.
MLA is always, not the periodicals, but the bibliography is always part of that.
I just wasn't.
Every once in a while, I click on the directory of periodicals by mistake and then say, what do you mean there's nothing in here with, periodicals, never mind. But yeah, the MLA International Bibliography is one of the subscription databases. And although it is not a full text database, if we have a full text database with one of the MLA articles in it, the MLA search results will link directly to it.
So we don't have to go.
You don't have to go find it. Or they now have a find it link that you can click on it, and then sometimes it pulls it up out of the databases. If it doesn't, it lets you click right over to Interlibrary Loan, where it automatically fills in all the fields.
I have done that a couple of times. That's a nice thing.
It's so great. We used to have to do it by hand on a piece of paper.
Right, I remember doing that with paper out. First time I did it online, I was like,
The charts, you made those charts that you have included? Okay. So did you just go through and count?
Well, no. You can, in the MLA, if you just sort of pull it up, it will often give you numbers.
We'll go over that,
Yeah.
the next class session, which is not next week. Right, we're not meeting next week, that's right,
Yeah.
we're researching.
So, yeah, no, I mean, well, obviously, I can easily count 5 things. But if you get one with lots and lots of things, each of the, like they have 20 entries on a page, there's a lot of data in the MLA because of its search functions, and I don't know many people who take the time to sort of do that. Like I say, once you get the searches, there's a whole little sort for relevance button. The sort for relevance button, newest article at the top, oldest article at the top, sort by author, sort by title, so you can click those any way you want. And then off on the bar on the left side of your screen, subjects and types of publications, you click over there and you can bring up more stuff. So it's really kind of like a corpus. Well, it is a corpus, and you can manipulate. It's fairly crude, but it still gives you access to a fair amount of information that can be gotten. But yeah, no, what I just did was just copy the numbers over into Excel spreadsheets and then make those. So,
This was great, Robin.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you. And it was perfect timing. As, what is your next assignment?
Essay or plagiarism.
Yes.
It's like
Was
you
I-
did that on purpose.
No, can you believe
It's just amazing how that worked out, isn't it? So you want to come to talk at the end about
Yeah.
stuff.
All right, so when does that assignment due?
March 5th.
Yes.
Is that, when
The
is?
week after.
It's not next week, but the week after.
So we're off for research day next week.
That's
And
perfect.
the following one is the missing.
Yeah. Which you'll have much of your work done. I'm working on getting, your bibliographies back to you. Which you'll want to pay attention to, because if I'm not happy with the sources, you'll have to find other sources to use in your bib essay.
Well, we're not using all those anyway.
No. This is a shorty. So, I mean, one could actually do an entire bib essay on definitions of plagiarism, which would probably be pretty interesting. And just to watch how it changes. And then there is an argument there that you're saying, well, this is where it started and this is where it ends, and here's where I think it will go or should go or something like that. And because of new developments, whatever, that's a possibility. Presentations start 13th. So everybody, if you haven't signed up for that one, just expect to start presenting after that. I'll work in 1 or 2 presentations a week.
The 13th, if you don't present on the 13th, then you need to start getting ready to present, because we'll do 1 or 2 presentations every single week after that.
I just need to take her wherever I go.
Good job.
Whoop, whoop, I'm gonna be looking for one,
Will there be an opportunity to do presentations on the week, March 7th, the week before that? Or not?
Is there anything going on?
That's the week that our paper is due, but I wasn't sure what this was.
Yeah. Yeah, we
You're glutton for punishment there, Chris? He's right.
Well, I signed up for the 13th, but I'm gonna be gone on spring break because kids are out, so I need to do it a week early if I can.
Okay. Questions so far, everything? You know what you're doing,
Yes.
right?
On what?
The essay.
Okay, yeah, that one. I'm good on that one.
Okay.
About what? 'Cause there's a lot of things I don't know what I'm doing.
So, here's the update for First Friday, which is March 1st, Friday of March 1st. Meet here
In this
This
classroom?
room?
in this classroom, 3 o'clock.
3 o'clock.
3.
I can't do
I know.
that.
Come when you can, though. It's gonna go till 5.
Kids have enough to get here.
I know. That was not my idea. That's all I'm saying.
And if
Because it's
we,
still recording,
You've
right?
said enough.
I think I said enough.
if we wanted to, like, Zoom in or whatever that
Yes,
is,
you'll be able to Zoom.
how do we, like,
I'll send out that information.
Will it be
Okay,
the
perfect.
same phone number that we use for the class?
I'm pretty sure it will be, yeah. But I'll send out all that information in the,
And then what are we doing after that?
Luigi's
Pizza.
That'd be Zoom though.
well, you can still have pizza.
You can Zoom right over
Are
there.
you-
We'll just
you could have
FaceTime,
been
right?
using Zoom.
Okay, I would Zoom in there. I was drinking before.
That's so funny. Hey, I'm at Luigi's waiting for you.
I got
I got a table. How many
Okay.
No, I'm not nervous.
So, Abigail and Greg, do you think you might be able to Zoom in for that, on that Friday? Maybe?
Right now, I think, yeah.
Good, good. And like I said, I'll be getting that email out tomorrow to set up the, after that though, it will be at 4 and not 3. Okay. Questions about anything going on? I've started sending back
your bibs. Not everybody has gotten here. In fact, very few have gotten back. But I'm working on that tomorrow.
Tomorrow, maybe Friday, maybe.
Saturday is good.
Friday's on the road to Granby.
Do you go every weekend?
No, every other weekend.
Oh, okay. And I was struggling to go home anyway.
You still want to hang that day?
Anything?
I have a
Yes, ma'am.
question.
Oh, yes, Abigail.
For our bib essays, do we need to have an argument or is it just a summarization of what they argue?
Do your very best to sort out an argument. You don't have time at this point of the semester to do the kind of bibliographical work that you would need to do in order to come up with a well-founded argument. Because you're not going to be reading every single article on plagiarism. You're not going to be reading 20% of them. But you can draw something from you can figure out something from the articles that you do discuss. At least.
This is not separated, right? It's just like, is it headed, like, does it have subheaders or is it just?
It can.
Okay.
Like, how do you?
Okay, I was wondering.
I like things broken up.
Okay.
Because I see a whole
Right.
large body of text.
And just go.
Cause in my mind right now, so far, mine was broken up like that. And I was like, is that what she?
Yes, that works just fine. And if you look at those examples I gave, some of them do and some don't.
Okay, right.
I prefer them to be organized so that I can follow them better.
Noted.
Well, I noticed a lot of journal articles are like that, though. We have.
Yeah.
Which are pretty long.
Exactly.
Of course,
Yeah, because then you don't have to read the whole thing. You can find a section you need.
Don't tell that.
Don't do that. Turn off the camera first.
edit that out.
Content.
Well, that actually is a shift from the new critics with their ideas of great literature and great writing. They had to craft these wonderful essays in the flow and the transition. And that was sort of this humanities idea. The social science people were saying, yeah, it makes it more sense to give you a heading and set you up and go from that. So as the discipline of literary studies, at least, composition, of course, is much newer. And I bet linguistics was always doing headers. Literary studies has gone to the idea, especially when you have, why spend a whole lot of time trying to craft huge, elegant transitions when you can be said, okay, we've dealt with this, now on to the next topic.
Exactly. And it's just so nice to see it set out
It's a signpost for a reader.
Yeah, and I need those signposts.
Bibliographic essays, I think, need these signposts more than some other kinds.
Yeah, for sure. All right, I'll be answering questions as we go.
Okay.
You're gonna do your research. Do research at this time next week, right?
Yes.
Totally
Absolutely.
not gonna be out drinking.
Definitely.
No.
You will meet next week for dinner.
The last two.
I just want to do one of the like this and how it
Mhm. Can I come right back?
Yeah.
Just to say, thank you, Robert. That was great. It was fun.
I just wanted to say, I'm meeting with Christina. I'll wonder.
I know. Well, Forrest. I think I've got you.